Well, it's almost 4 years now that Russell Lamberti made the break from entrepreneurship and macroeconomics to becoming an executive director and the chief economist at Sakeliga, where it's a story of advocacy. And he's really in the advocacy boat today when we talk about the most recent threat to South Africa's prosperity and an opportunity by the ANC to use the power that it has, presumably, to change the way that companies employ people down to exactly how many people of various races and even sexes have to be within their organizations. Russell, you guys at Sakeliga, just maybe give me a little bit of background on what it is. Not me, I know exactly what you guys do, but telling those who are maybe coming across you for the first time, what the purpose is.
Yeah, thanks, Alec. It's fantastic to be with you to talk about this. We Sakeliga was founded in 2011 by a group of quite visionary businessmen who realized that there needed to be an organization to form part of a resistance against what was, even back then, increasingly becoming very harmful state intervention and regulation over this economy. And so our mission, we exist to work towards and create a flourishing and favorable business environment for companies, for businesses operating in South Africa and all the communities that they serve, which includes, shareholders, but also employees, customers, and all other kinds of stakeholders. So, we think that, a flourishing economy is, of huge importance. Many people believe that, but everyone has different ideas as to how to get there. But what we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years is a tremendous wave of excessive regulation, in all sorts of ways in this economy that have really crippled some of the major driving sectors of this economy. Mining, manufacturing, construction sectors have been absolutely slammed over the last 10 to 20 years. And we are trying to fight back so that doesn't become the fate of other important sectors like technology sectors and business services sectors and so on, but also to try and restore health in some of these other areas of the economy. And Alec, our primary mechanism of doing that at this stage is through what we call public interest litigation or public policy litigation, where we really try and push back in the courts against what we consider to be very harmful legislation and regulation, unconstitutional legislation and regulation, and pinning regulators and government officials back into their kind of very tightly defined constitutional boxes so that they do what they have to do, but they don't overreach their powers and meddle unnecessarily in the economy.
Now, you're combining with Neasa and issuing an urgent interdict. You've done it this week. Just tell us why and what it is.
Yes, so Neasa is the National Employers Association of South Africa. They are a tremendous partner and friend of Sakeliga, and we are going into this case together with them. We both agree wholeheartedly with one another that these regulations, these employment equity regulations, which come from the Amendment Act, that have now, and these regulations now give effect to those amendments, that these are extremely harmful and constitute unlawful and frankly impossible quotas, hiring quotas for employers. So Neasa represents thousands of employers. Sakeliga, we ourselves have thousands of supporters and funders for our mission. And so we felt, and as did Neasa felt, that one another were the right partners to go into this case together. Just by way of brief background, the Employment Equity Act comes from 1998, so it's been around a long time. There's been a couple of significant amendments over the years, but the most recent amendments are by far the most extreme, the most draconian for businesses to really comply with and to follow. That was signed by the president early this year, and the regulations were finally announced in April. So very, very recently. And so this court application is actually an urgent application, Alec, because what these regulations are going to do is they are going to, if we do not succeed in this urgent application, to have them interdicted, to essentially have these things set aside until part B of our court case, which is the substantive case to actually deal with these regulations. We have then, if we don't succeed in that, we have a situation where businesses now have to, from the 1st of September, which is just around the corner, have to start incurring enormous costs to implement policies, Alec, that are going to be coming under judicial review and may be declared unlawful a year down the line. And so we are saying to the courts, it is far more sensible and far more prudent and rational to, at the very least, maintain the status quo while these regulations come under review, so that we don't move into a situation where businesses start incurring enormous compliance costs only a year later to be told, well, no, it reverts back to the old thing, which then creates another whole set of new kind of compliance costs. This is just this constitutes, we think, irreparable harm to businesses. So part A of our application, to simplify this, is an urgent application to say to the court and to ask the court, these need to be set aside while we then bring part B of the application, which is the substantive case around the constitutionality, procedural issues, the substantive issues around these regulations, which we think are, constitute unconstitutional regulations, but also create impossible requirements and irrational requirements on large swaths of the economy and various sectors in terms of the way that these have been created. We can get into the substance of what these regulations essentially say, Alec, but you've basically summed it up, which is that they are for the first time setting down very, very explicit, to the decimal point, explicit race and gender and disability quotas for companies to hire. So company hiring must now be done on a sort of grid, a kind of a bit of a spreadsheet grid, Alec, where you are bean counting the race and the gender and the disability of your staff, and that this now must try and conform to some sort of national picture of race and demographics and so on. And it's just simply not how hiring is done in the real world, and it adds another enormous rigidity to the labor market. And you know well, Alec, that South Africa sits with one of the most rigid labor markets with very, very difficult labor laws to try and navigate. Employers watching this will know. And what this ultimately does, very sadly, unfortunately, is diminish dramatically jobs and employment opportunities and growth prospects, which is precisely what this whole economy needs.
Russell, I'd really like to unpack and put some context onto all of this. But first off, because there've got to be many employers who are saying, I'm just not going to follow this. This is bullshit. There's no way that I can run a business and comply with some bureaucrats' ridiculous laws that they're trying to implement. So I'm sure people are thinking about that, but are they not also thinking about that on the way that BEE itself is being imposed on them? And I ask you you are clearly saying you're following the legal processes. You believe in the rule of law. But what happens? What do you advise one of your members who has a business that they have now up to 10 million rand turnover? There's no issue with BEE, but they've now broken above 10 million rand turnover. Suddenly, they're faced with a situation that unless they give 51% of their equity of their company to a person other than white, they will have effectively a negative rating whenever they try and do business with the government or with big companies. And as a consequence, they might as well, I don't know, emigrate, close shop, or do what a number of people are doing, which is creating lots of other little businesses that they then operate through. The complexities that it causes is obvious, but from your side, what do you say to people in that position?
Well, it's a great and very, very difficult question in totality. And what you've just done there, Alec, is you've sketched out quite well, but really just the tip of the iceberg of the regulatory web and the sort of racialization of the economy that has been ratcheting higher over the last 25 years. I mean, this is a 25, 30-year story. We didn't notice this so much in the 1990s because it was primarily, certainly on, from the BEE side, it was largely kind of voluntary empowerment deals that were happening in the 90s. There was no particular legislative imperative to do this kind of thing. Employment equity comes in 1998, but it's really mainly focused on state institutions. We quite quickly get a purge of white people from various state departments and so on through voluntary retrenchment packages and all that. And we do start to see that when you hire on the basis of race and rather than value or merit, you start seeing a deterioration in the quality of state services and so on and so forth. But, for the first 10 years, and certainly the political milieu at the time made it very, very difficult to firmly oppose these things. But these have been ratcheting up over time, over the last number of years. And really in the last 6 or 7 years, we see that we're in something that we call the third wave of BE. And just without getting into all the weeds of this, in essence, what that is doing, Alec, is for the first time, not just regulating the relationship between businesses and the state in state contracts and tenders and that sort of thing, but really trying to regulate business to business relationships. In other words, saying you may not do business at all with other businesses, let alone the state, unless you comply with certain BEE conditions. And this is creeping into several important sectors in the economy. Some regulators have tried to explicitly attach BEE to your license to operate at all, your ability to physically operate your business, regardless of who you're selling to. You might be an exporter, and so this is coming in very strongly. So really, the employment equity regulations, which relate to hiring, your workforce, are just a kind of force multiplier, if you like, of the broader picture of race-based economics. So it's an incredibly difficult, regulatory web and sort of labyrinth to navigate. So this comes to your question: what do we tell people? There's several things we tell people. Number one is it's absolutely critical that we pull on all the levers that we can to resist these sorts of regulations. So step one is litigation. Litigation is not the final answer, but it's a good first answer. It's a good first step. And it can certainly delay and get very, very good results. And Sakeliga has shown that. So we are encouraging businesses to get behind, yes, our litigation, but anyone who's constructively pushing back and using constitutional and legal mechanisms to push back against these sorts of regulations. And we've already had some success in that. Outside of court, pre-litigation, kind of engagements with the state where they see that we're coming and they kind of pull back. We've also had real success in the courts. We had a 5-year battle against very, very harmful and racialized procurement practices that were announced by Pravin Gordhan in 2017. And we won that case in 2022. And that has enabled well-run municipalities to actually unlock, hundreds of millions or if not billions in savings. So there is some success in the legal mechanism, and we encourage people to support that. We also encourage, and particularly in this instance, we encourage businesses to engage with Neasa, who we're partnering with on this case. Neasa have an excellent track record in representing businesses in labor matters and giving very sound advice on how to navigate these dynamics. In this particular instance, our advice is to not over-comply or do excessive pre-compliance, to wait first and foremost for the judgment on this urgent interdict. If we're successful there, it gives businesses breathing room to hold off and to not start incurring costs that may ultimately be seen to have been unnecessary costs to incur, Alex. So we like to call that last bit of advice something like maximum appropriate non-compliance or non-cooperation, or if you spun it the other way, kind of maximum ethical non-cooperation or non-compliance. So the idea here is until you absolutely have to do that which is harmful and that which is, in many people's opinion, unethical, hold off on doing that, stand your ground, make reasonable justifications as to why you don't need to do that, rather than trying to figure out, reasons to do it. And that part of that is also engaging with your compliance teams and your compliance officers and saying, guys, show us how to minimally comply rather than to, be involved in excessive over-compliance or pre-compliance. Now, this might not sound hugely substantive, but we've encountered several sectors and several situations where companies are put under pressure by regulators, Alec, and people feel scared. They feel intimidated by the state. The state's a very powerful institution. And so they start engaging in a lot of pre-compliance and over-compliance. And this actually makes the government's job a whole lot easier, because there's this wave of kind of cooperation. If we have a wave of non-cooperation, ethical non-cooperation, certainly before any kind of firm announcements are made around the direction of, for example, where these employment equity laws are going, if we have a wave of non-cooperation, it makes it far, far more difficult for government to actually implement what it wants to. And so a combination, Alec, of litigation, of public pressure, of engaging with our international trade partners and helping them understand the policy landscape as clearly as possible domestically, so that they can start to bring their own pressure to bear on the South African government, because these policies have significant bearing on foreign companies operating here, and foreign companies operating here are subject to these rules and regulations. And so you have a situation where European companies who are expressly prohibited in their home countries from even, measuring anyone's race or anything like that in their hiring processes, in their South African division, are forced to do precisely the opposite. They're forced to categorize people by race and to bean count along racial and sex and disability lines and so on. So a combination of all these things, and then finally a wave of ethical non-cooperation, is going to be the start of an important resistance against this, Alec, and we've just got to keep ratcheting that up across the business sphere, because ultimately this is an incredibly harmful policy, not just for businesses, not just for the bottom line and for profits and for shareholders, for workers, for staff, for employees, and perhaps even most importantly, for the unemployed. This is a tremendous barrier to growth and new job creation. And so really, once again, Alec, the voiceless are the huge swaths of unemployed people in this country who this policy gives absolutely no more hope of finding gainful employment.
Or indeed entering the formal economy. It sounds a little bit like the Gandhi approach of non-violent cooperation. It does appear as though there are lots of ways of addressing or skinning this cat. But back to that specific question of the small business that's broken through the 10 million rand barrier.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting one, because one of the problems with this barrier, and it's very clever, is that when you invoke the fact that you're under the barrier, you're actually starting to play the game. You're actually playing the BEE game. You're just saying, I get an exemption. And so you're actually getting a BEE score by invoking that you're underneath this barrier. So one piece of advice for companies starting out and, who are small and who are starting to grow is wean yourself off as much as you can the need to even invoke the exemption for small companies. In other words, don't play the game, because the BEE game is a game that sucks you in. The goalposts shift. Things get more and more onerous as you grow. And if you can start from when you're small, not requiring that. And I have some experience of this as a small business owner, prior to joining Sakeliga, and being required to be BEE compliant. And I could have at that time invoked that I was under a threshold. And I chose not to, precisely because I knew that one day if I got above that threshold, I would be sucked into the game already. So I think that's a big thing for those companies who are crossing those thresholds and moving into these places. It's difficult. It's very easy for someone who's not in your shoes as a business owner to say, yeah, just don't comply or don't do BEE. And, doesn't matter what, just doesn't matter what happens. The fact is that some people are locked into contracts with large companies or with sometimes with government entities, and they kind of are under a lot of pressure. I would say two things. I would say, number one, sometimes you have more leverage than you think. If you're a very good supplier and your product is sought after, you will get pressure from a big company's compliance officers or procurement officers. But they do have room to accommodate non-BEE suppliers if you're a good supplier. And if you're supplying something that's differentiated and something that's very necessary to that business. And I would say if you feel that that's the nature of your product, you can go in with a bit more confidence into those kinds of discussions and negotiations. That's number one. Number two, I think you've got to set yourself a kind of 5 to 7 year plan to wean yourself out of this pressure to do BEE. And that's a process, and that's something like, what can I do in 2025 to be less dependent on these sorts of customers or these sorts of networks that are forcing me into something that is harmful for my business and that I don't actually want to do? What can I do this year to be just even 5 or 10% less dependent than I was last year? And maybe that's developing export markets or seeking new kind of customer networks. And then if you do that process every year for 5 or 6 years, you can find yourself getting into a far stronger position in relation to this stuff. So there's no easy answers. And of course, the final thing, and this is a shameless plug, but get behind the efforts of a group like Sakeliga, groups like Neasa, who are pushing back and not just buying time, but in many instances, really rolling back regulatory burdens. So buying time is important. Rolling back the burdens are important, so that we can survive for another day, so that we can live to fight again, down the line, and create this space for ourselves to do value-based, free and open business, trade, and commerce. That's the goal. And that's a goal that everyone can get behind. It's a goal that is broad based, and it's actually a popular goal, because that's where job growth comes from. That's where real business growth comes from. So that's what I would say to people. There's no nice, neat answer to that, but as much as possible, don't roll over and don't just accept your fate. Figure out, speak to good compliance teams who are savvy to clever ways and means around these sorts of regulations as much as possible.
Russell, there's another point that I'd love to get your insights on. We're seeing that many South Africans, well, I guess those who would have emigrated have now emigrated. A lot of their kids have gone and people are staying here, but those who weren't really committed to South Africa have gone. And then a lot of others have semigrated. The move towards the Western Cape has been very, very strong as well. Surely at some point in time, if this continuation of these onerous laws hits your front door, you've got to believe that those people, a little bit like in Atlas Shrugged, when all the entrepreneurs went off to their little enclave and they basically left the world as far as the bureaucrats were concerned, that at some point in time there will be irresistible pressure for a secession, for a breakaway, for a move away from this often illogical and very ruinous economic policies. We're just seeing right now the way that South Africa has played Donald Trump has been appalling. Whether you know or believe that Trump is a fool is irrelevant. 250 billion rands worth of South African exports are going to be blocked in the US market at the end of the month because we have not done anything to even engage with this guy. So if you're a business person in that situation and you're now seeing this market just evaporate because of poor action by your leaders, surely you're going to take a step in some direction. And maybe that would be something as pretty obvious or blindingly obvious, the Cape Independence protagonists tell us, as go to a place which is not subject to the laws of those who would impose really bad ones on you. I know it's a philosophical thing, but I'd love to get your view on this.
Huge question, major talking point. I would say that firstly, I would I would push back a little bit and say that, unfortunately, Alec, and I wish you were right, but unfortunately, the immigration story is still a very, very significant factor. I mean, I don't know what the run rate is on immigration, right now, at this moment, but I think that everyone has different tolerance levels, and to your point, probably the people with with lower tolerance levels for being in South Africa, they've left, and they left in the 90s and the early 2000s and so on. But if things get bad enough, people will move. That's just the reality. We saw that in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had major waves of immigration, white and black. And at every point, it felt like, okay, the people who are staying now, they're really committed, but kept on bleeding people through those sort of crises. So I would say that this can always get worse. Strict kind of things like Cape Independence and so on are extremely difficult to achieve politically. And immigration to other countries that are more stable and friendlier to people, to businesses, and so on, is still an easier release valve. If that becomes a harder kind of release valve, I think you're going to see more and more real pressure for not just Cape Independence as a kind of strict concept, but I think decentralized governance, more and more alternatives to what we perceive to be things that only the state has up until now, provided. So independent energy grid. So there's almost kind of philosophically, there's a broad independence movement because people are trying to break away from dependence on a failing state. Now, of course, one of the ways that is manifesting is people moving to the western half of the country where there's better governance. There seems to be more chance of living in peace, having relatively lower crime rates, better kind of government services and public services and so on and so forth, and ultimately more friendly environment for getting on and doing business. But of course, we're still subject to these central laws and regulations from the state. So I would, rather than necessarily commenting on the virtue of these kinds of movements, I would just say that I think there's some degree of inevitability about your line of questioning. Yeah, I think for a series of communities that just want to get on and build and create value and have good lives, to be constantly put upon by kind of very, very socialistic and racial socialistic central government is kind of intolerable over time. So I think this is only going to get more salient, Alec, in the conversation. Cape Independence itself as a concept has a kind of broad but quite shallow support. So it does quite well in polling. If you poll people in the Western Cape, they are quite well disposed to the idea, but it's shallow in the sense that people are not yet willing to really go the extra mile to kind of push for that. So it's a nice idea. It's a nice sort of sentiment. But to really do what's required for something like that takes a huge amount of political will, a lot of funding, and a lot of political skill. And at the moment, I think we're still, the best thing I can say about that is that we're in the early stages of the creation of this kind of movement. But I'm not convinced that there's enough groundswell there, and also that the release valve, the alternative release valve of immigration, has become difficult enough yet to really start seeding a very strong domestic kind of secession or independence movement. But prior to that, I think that we are absolutely in the era of independence, which is become as independent as possible. We like to consider ourselves an independent business community, a selfstandige sakegemeenskap, as you can see behind me. And that just means, it starts in your mind. It starts in the networks that you create. It starts in how you start unplugging yourself from excessive dependence on a clearly failing system. It starts with pushing back in the courts, maximum non-compliance where appropriate, and we continue to build on this, I'm not saying this is a silver bullet. This is not a short-term project that we're about here. But if we continue to build on this kind of independent thinking, that starts to actuate more defined, more clearly defined, and even more formalistic kind of political independence in various ways, shapes, and forms. And I think that's the path that we're on. So it's maybe not the nice, neat answer that people want to hear, but I'm afraid there's no clicking of fingers and suddenly we live in some kind of Western Cape utopia. This is a long, hard process, and people need to if they really care about the idea of independence in general, of decentralized governance, of breaking away from this very, very kind of oppressive and draconian centralized policy structure, then it's about putting shoulders to the wheel and really working hard for that sort of outcome. Alternatively to that, then people must just consider, people will consider moving elsewhere in the world.
Oppressive, draconian, and as we heard from General Mkhwanazi, corrupt to the core. Well, it's a system that there is being kicked back against. Russell Lamberti with Sakeliga has given us some excellent second-level thinking. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.